Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching India as well with me, Frank Rausam Pereira. The Maldives last Monday reaffirmed its India First policy, saying it looks forward to working closely with India on all issues and will remain sensitive towards its security and strategic concerns as External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj held talks with the country's top leadership. The Maldivian leaders also expressed commitment to support India's efforts to combat terrorism, particularly cross-border terrorism and crimes such as piracy, organized crime, narcotic drugs and human trafficking. On this edition of India's World, we will take stock of the status of the ties between India and the Maldives. Joining me on the program today are Shilkant Sharma, former ambassador, Sreeram Chaulia, Dean, Jindal School of International Affairs, and Commodore Anil Jay Singh, retired Vice President, Indian Maritime Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. That having been said, Professor, is it important for us also not to be complacent? Because let's not forget, China is going to constantly try and make inroads into Maldives. Something is going to happen sometime in the near future also, maybe.
Frank, as soon as Ibrahim Solih got elected, within weeks, in October 2018, the Chinese ambassador in Mali is supposed to have met him and presented him with an invoice of $3.2 billion owed by Maldives to China. And just for perspective for our viewers, the total GDP of the Maldives is around $3.9 billion. So essentially what the Chinese are saying is, you are in hock to us by almost 100% of your national income. And since then, you know, the Chinese, the debt owed by the Maldives to China is still being recalculated, because the previous regime, the authoritarian regime of Abdullah Yamin, had engaged in a lot of hanky-panky with the Chinese that was totally non-transparent and undemocratic. So now the new government is in many ways discovering how much of a debt trap it is already been dragged into. And they're trying to, I think they will need to repudiate some of these Chinese debts, because some of these actually enriched Yamin and his cronies and did not really benefit the nation of Maldives. So I think, but the Chinese will use that creditor leverage to try and remain in the game. And that is the big thing for them, because, you know, that's how they have been able to look at weak countries which are, economically down, and then that's how they capture them and they bring them into their orbit. So I think the Chinese will continue to use, I mean, they can go to international arbitration and other forms to try and enforce their claims. And they will always, Chinese statecraft is to use economic levers to extract political advantages. So they will say that, you know, you need to restrain this India First and all that eventually, or at least you should not be inimical to Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and other plans in the Indian Ocean, or else we will, raise the claims. So I think they're going to hold on to this debt in a way to try and squeeze Maldives. And therefore, I think it's very important. Prime Minister Modi announced $1.4 billion financial package when Ibrahim Solih visited in December. And I think that is going to go towards budgetary support, but also for social and economic projects, new projects, which will be sustainable and which will not be, white elephants like what the Chinese had done under Yamin. So I think it's very important that we do understand that the Chinese are there, and the entire region, even Sri Lanka for that matter, or a number of other countries across the Western Indian Ocean region are already part of the Belt and Road. So the question for us is now, what do we do about reducing the dependence of these small countries? And I think we have done a bold step. Just for perspective, Bhutan, Nepal and Afghanistan, these three countries have traditionally been the largest recipients of Indian assistance, development assistance. But now Maldives has come in. We were totally reluctant to commit anything as long as the old regime was there. But now we are saying, in a way, we are incentivizing the democratic resurgence in the Maldives by saying, if they go in a democratic and a moderate fashion as we are seeing under the current administration, we appreciate that and we will try to nurture it. If they go against our interests, we will not. And we have said the same to some of these other recipients in our neighborhood too in the past. And certainly we would not want the Maldives to repay the Chinese debt using Indian money. So what we would want is for the Maldives to become self-sufficient, self-reliant, and to be able to have both economic and strategic military capabilities of its own, so that it is able to hold off from this, looming shadow of the Chinese.
Professor, are there any aspects of the bilateral relationship that need special attention, do you think?
Well, Frank, I think we have historically been worried about the trend of Islamist radicalization in the Maldives, and the previous regime of Abdullah Yamin had deliberately stoked and encouraged that phenomenon for domestic political polarization in the Maldives. Now, thankfully, we have a strong, moderate and secular regime of Ibrahim Solih. So, and they are quite committed to de-radicalizing their society. And that's one area I think we must pay attention to it, because of the geographical proximity and the risk of jihadist activity in which harms our interests emanating from countries like the Maldives. So I think we need to do a lot with regard to, for example, we have a lot of moderate Islamic clerics who can be highly beneficial in turning around the opinions in the Maldives. They have their Maulavis and their systems, many of which are inspired by the Saudi Arabian, the Wahhabi model. And that's something, and also by the Pakistanis, by the way, who, although it's a very small country, Pakistan has used these factors to align itself with the previous regime of Abdullah Yamin. So it's very important for us to work to clear the ideological brainwashing, especially of the youth. So you mentioned the youth. Sports is a good thing, but we should also bring them over in large numbers, expose them to the tolerant and extremely moderate forms of Islam that we have in India. And I think that connection will help us a lot. The other point I mentioned before as well, Frank, is that with regard to housing and so on, which are quite desperate need in the Maldives, our companies, remember GMR was building the airport and it was booted out by Yamin. So we have a large number of companies. Prime Minister Modi has been talking to his Maldivian counterpart about bringing back our companies to build those sustainable housing projects. These kind of things will make a real difference on the ground in people's lives. And last but not least, I'll say that we have the IORA, Indian Ocean Regional Association, and Maldives is one of the members, and so is India and Australia. So all of us, I think we need to think about Maldives in the larger picture of the IORA and how we can come up with the common principles for democracy, common principles for moderate forms of politics, common principles on the basis of which we can build the sustainable development.
Right.
So if we can come up with norms and then implement it at a wider scale, we can also pull in others. Remember, Madagascar, Mauritius, Seychelles, all these are in the vicinity of the Maldives, and all of them are part of the IORA. And so if we use the IORA mechanisms, apart from the bilateral, already India, Maldives, in many ways, I think Prime Minister Modi has proved his detractors wrong, because they were saying that we lost the Maldives. And now, they're all quiet because we regained the Maldives. So the point is that, but apart from bilateral, I think if we can bring in a kind of a support group of key countries. And Sri Lanka, I will emphasize this, Frank, Sri Lanka is very critical because the Maldives and Sri Lanka ethnically have very close, bonds going back historically. And, the democracy movement that survived the Yamin dictatorship was mostly based in Sri Lanka, including Nasheed. So we need to bring in Sri Lanka also, and because Sri Lanka also recently there was an attempt to overthrow a democratically elected regime and it survived. So if we can create a Friends of Maldives kind of a grouping that can sustain this, because otherwise the Chinese will create the propaganda and the Pakistanis that, the Indians are doing hegemony in the Maldives.
And everyone can help each other out.
So IORA should be the vehicle, I think, to prop up Maldives and make it stable.
All right. Closing comments now from all my guests. Right. Professor, close the show for us.
Frank, the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which we and Japan have pioneered, involves, linking Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia with South Asia and the eastern coast of Africa. Now, under Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, we should bring in the Japanese in a big way as well to the Maldives, because, they want to also express themselves. And they want to prevent a kind of Chinese hegemony in the Indo-Pacific also. And Japan has a kind of resources that we don't have. But together with Japan, if we can, make Maldives a kind of a pilot country for Asia-Africa Growth Corridor and implement specific projects there, Japan, India +1 kind of a model, I think it will go a very long way to bring the Maldives to the next level. Maldives is not a very poor country, in terms of, it's almost like a middle income country with a small population. So, 3 or 4 big Japanese and, Indian projects jointly can completely transform the face of that country. And as democracies, I'm sure that we will, not go down the line of what the Chinese have done,
Right.
So it will give confidence to people of Maldives and sustain this second phase of democracy that has begun in that country.
Absolutely. All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India as World. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us.